you so much. Sorry. Thank you so much, Jessica and Rebecca, for your talks. They really laid the perfect groundwork for my talk. My name is Angel Selden, and I find more joy in learning with my children than almost anything else in my life. I find so much joy in, I suppose you could call it homeschooling. To me, it's just a lifestyle. It's the way we live. We learn together, and I learn and work on my projects, and my kids learn and work on their projects, and we learn together, and it's quite an adventure. When my oldest daughter was a little over a year old, this is my oldest daughter, Lydia, who's in charge of the slideshows for me. She's 14 now. But when she was a little over a year old, we lived in an apartment complex. My husband was still in school at the time. And we would frequently get together with a couple of other moms and their babies in our apartment complex at the playground. And I remember at one of these play dates, the moms did this trick with their babies where they would say, "What does the cow say?" Or, "What does the pig say?" And the baby would actually respond with the appropriate animal sound. Well, this threw me into a slight panic because Lydia did not know her animal sounds yet. And I thought she was falling behind. So as soon as I got a chance, I went to the library and I checked out a book on barnyard animal sounds. And we read through that book over and over again until she had her animal sounds. I don't even think I realized at the time that she probably had no idea the meaning of those sounds that she was uttering. But she seemed so advanced when she could do it, of course. I didn't know it at the time, but we were following the conventional model of education in which, hit the slide, in which you learn and collect bits and pieces of information, like little building blocks, that with the idea that one day you would be able to put all of these blocks together to build a complete picture of the world, or at least build your future career. In this model, genius is a potential byproduct of accumulating lots of bits and pieces of information throughout your childhood or over the years. My model of learning has changed slightly since drilling animal sounds with my baby. It's actually the opposite of the conventional model. So instead of starting with the bits and pieces of information, we focus on the complete picture and cultivating genius from the very beginning. And the bits and pieces of knowledge are accumulated as a byproduct of that, not the other way around. To clarify, my idea of genius has nothing to do with IQ or precociousness or daily violin lessons with your 2-year-old. My definition of genius, go ahead, is the creations only you can contribute to this world, drawing upon your personal life experiences, interests, and divine gifts. Each one of you and your children has the power to create. I'll even take that a step further and say that each one of you and your children was born to create. And there is something that you can create to contribute to this world that no one else can. Because no one else in the history of the world has the exact same combination of divine gifts, interests, and personal life experiences as you have. Creation is not limited to the arts. You can create organizations like this. You can create businesses, buildings, websites, blogs. You can create relationships, connections, awareness, change, laughter, peace, and joy. This is the focus of our family's education, to discover and cultivate this creative power. Everything else, knowledge, skills, character, self-reliance, will be developed as a byproduct of focusing on that genius, not the other way around, which is the conventional wisdom. Let me explain how this works. You know, I meant to look it up, but I'll just explain it. My daughter Mary has dreamed of owning a bakery ever since she was 6 years old. She would spend a lot of time writing lists of what she wanted to sell at her bakery and designing a plan for what she wanted her store to look like. And one night at bedtime when she was 8 years old, she said to me, "Oh, Mom, I wish that I could open up my bakery right now." Because I had told her that she can't open up a bakery until she's at least 18 years old. But in a stroke of inspiration, I said, "Hey, why don't you just open up an online bakery that's just made to order?" Now, a couple of years later, she's teaming up with her friend Libby, who also has entrepreneurial desires and drives, to start the Young Entrepreneurs Fair. So they're going to host a bazaar where, you know, their friends who also have an interest in making something to sell, they'll all get together and they'll sell these things, and they are going to donate their profits to various charitable causes, including one of those charitable causes will be to the orphan home that my daughters and I recently visited in Nepal. Okay, actually, yeah, next slide. Okay, so this is them working on their Young Entrepreneurs Fair. They're laughing because they named one of their files None of Your Beeswax and didn't realize that when they uploaded it to the website that people would actually be able to see that it was named None of Your Beeswax, so they had to go back and change the name and re-upload it. So they had a really great time doing that. Go ahead, next slide. This is what she learned from this experience. This is the knowledge and skills she gained as a byproduct of cultivating this passion of hers. Math, how to create and use a spreadsheet. Arithmetic, how to calculate how much it costs you per cupcake or cookie. How to determine and calculate profit. Research the going rate for cupcakes and cookies. How to calculate how much you're making per hour. Cooking measurements, volume, weight, fractions, money, time. The character skills she developed were generosity through the fundraising effort, honesty, follow through, building trust, people skills, how to work hard, how to deal with stress, time management. That's huge if you have somebody who's expecting to get an order for a birthday party. By the way, her business is called Birthday Bake Shop. And you know that you have to have it done by a certain time. Much more effective than an arbitrary due date, saying, I just want you to have it into me by this date just so you can learn how to keep a deadline. This is a real deadline. Business skills, customer service, marketing, referrals, time management, how to meet that. Oh, that's all in character too. I mean, there's so much overlap here, really. That wasn't a typo. There's a lot of these things fall into multiple categories. Law of diminishing returns. We've had a lot of cool conversations about the law of diminishing returns, and then they'll say, we went sledding one day, and after 2 hours, Lydia said, Mom, does the law of diminishing returns apply to sledding? Because it sure feels like it. What's worth my time? What's not worth my time? Discounts for broken cookies. Clearancing unsold items. Negotiation, barter, work ethics. Look for the win-win. Organizational skills, delegation, recruiting, planning, how to work with a partner. And how to bake and cook, photography, writing, clear and effective written communication, typing, spelling. It's a lot from one project. Okay, next slide. So, Mary's desire to start a bakery is symbolized by this seed, which hopefully most of you got, this mustard seed. If you didn't get it, that's how small it is. This seed could represent something that piques your interest, something that sparks joy, maybe a place you want to visit, or somebody you want to meet and talk to. an experience you want to have, anything that you feel drawn to. It is small and insignificant looking. You probably would not even notice that if you walked past it on the ground. And it looks nothing like the fully grown plant and fruit that it has the potential to become. How many of these seeds do you think we pass on the ground that go unnoticed? When we plant this seed, it starts to sprout up, but it also grows roots down into the soil. These roots represent the knowledge and skills gained from feeding this seed of genius. They are connected in a network, and they all feed into this main stem. They all feed living and breathing genius. Everything we do in our family shines light on this genius, except for when the kids fight, or when I lose my temper. That doesn't shed light on our genius, but the goal is we try to make everything we do shed light on our genius. If it's not shining a light on it, it is casting a shadow. And we need to get rid of it, just like Jessica said. I'm using genius and creative potential all interchangeably, if you haven't noticed. So how do we cultivate this creative power? That's the question, right? How do I do this? How do I implement this then? There are 3 necessary components to cultivating genius. Go ahead. Observe creative genius, play at creative genius, and share your creative genius. We do this together as well as independently. And actually, parents cultivating their own genius is a really powerful part of cultivating your children's genius. It's like a pregnant mother taking care of her own health. She is taking care of her baby's health by taking care of her own health. And it's the same with education. Go ahead. Observe creative genius. Okay, so there are 3 ways that we do this. One of the ways, obviously, through reading books, as Rebecca talked about. Go ahead, next slide. 3 main ways that we observe creative genius are through great media. The best books, films, performances, art, and magazines. We don't settle for mediocrity. Nature, to me, this is the highest form of creative genius. And people. People in our community, that actually includes children observing their parents, cultivating their creative genius. Doesn't matter where you are in the process. You can just be starting. You can be feeding your own creative genius by just reading books that you're interested in or working on a project. Go ahead, next slide. So as we were preparing for our trip to Nepal, we decided that, of course, we wanted to climb Mount Everest, and we did, vicariously through John Krakauer in his book, Into Thin Air, which is his account of the 1996 Mount Everest disaster. I have no desire to climb a mountain. I'm not interested in mountain climbing at all, but I don't have to be interested in mountain climbing in order to enjoy a work of genius like this and be able to experience it through him. This particular book I read to Lydia, my 14-year-old, every night at bedtime. So we have, just a side note, we have 2 read aloud times every day. The first one is after breakfast and chores in the morning, and the second is in the evening at bedtime. And my husband and I actually take turns reading to the kids at bedtime, and we make a great team because I like reading classic literature and memoirs and biographies to the kids. And my husband makes up these crazy comedic fairy tales. That's his creative genius. And I actually walked in on one of these storytelling sessions a couple nights ago. Not to embarrass my husband, but my 6-year-old son was looking down my husband's throat, and my 10-year-old daughter said, "Mom, Dad said that when he was a teenager, he got his uvula pierced." And I come to find out I come to find out that in this fairy tale that he told that night, the 12 dancing princesses all got their uvulas pierced because it was the latest trend, but their nemesis, Evil Eye, couldn't get his uvula pierced because he couldn't afford it, and so he was rejected by everyone that did have their uvula pierced. And I think that's so important. That's an important part of their education. The imagination and the laughter and just that bonding with their dad. I love it. So while those kids were laughing with Neil, you know, Lydia and I are sobbing in each other's arms violently because David Copperfield's stepfather is shaming him, or because we're stranded on Mount Everest in a blizzard and we can't breathe. Lots of tears when I read to the kids. It's really common. Go ahead, next slide. So this is actually the expedition that we climbed to the summit of Everest with, vicariously. And Lydia said that when she looks at this picture, it makes her heart swell and her eyes will up with tears, because it really feels like we became friends with these people as we got to know them throughout the book. And when lives were lost, we cried, we grieved over their loss. So Rob Hall is in the Purple Zubas, and he was the leader of the expedition. And at one point, he had been stranded near the summit of Everest for over 16 hours in this terrible blizzard. He had severe frostbite, and he had been without supplemental oxygen. At the height that a 747 flies, he was up there without supplemental oxygen for over 16 hours, and without water also, which you need over a gallon of water a day when you're up on Everest. So I'm gonna read this part after he had been stranded up there for 16 hours, just a small excerpt. He was actually able to, after that over 16 hours, on his walkie-talkie, he radioed down to base camp, and Helen at base camp was able to call his wife, Jan Arnold, in New Zealand, who was pregnant with their first child, via satellite phone, and she put the walkie-talkie up to the satellite phone so he could talk to his wife while he was stranded in a blizzard on top of Mount Everest. He rasped in a slow, horribly distorted voice, "Hi, my sweetheart. I hope you're tucked up in a nice warm bed. How are you doing?" I'm going to skip over some of this. "I'm looking forward to making you completely better when you come home," said Arnold. "I just know you're going to be rescued. Don't feel that you're alone. I'm sending all my positive energy your way." Before signing off, Hall told his wife, "I love you. Sleep well, my sweetheart. Please don't worry too much." These would be the last words anyone would hear him speak. And at that point, I wasn't even physically capable of reading anymore. And Lydia, she's crying now, see? And of course, you didn't travel up to for 250 pages with us, up to the top of Everest with these people. This is why I love homeschooling. It was a joyful experience, and I know that, and it wasn't always for me. You know, I struggled a lot like Rebecca. But it just seems like too many families, whether they send their kids to public school or whether they homeschool, education is just this drudgery that we just have to get through it, because you just need to get through it in order to get to where you want to be. And for us, we are enjoying the moment so much right now, and I want to be able to share that with others. Like Rebecca said, everybody has their own way, but so maybe you're thinking, isn't that sweet? But really, what did you learn from this? Like, educationally, what are they learning from this? So let's see what we learned. I took a few notes. I won't read all these like I did the other one, but here's all the science that we learned that I remembered. So there was probably more in the book. Now, almost all of this on the list was things that we learned just from reading this book, and maybe a few Google searches also while we were reading the book. Okay. You can just flip through. Philosophy and ethics, one that's interesting. Who was Calvin and what was his philosophy? How is climbing Everest Calvinistic? Because he refers to climbing Everest as a Calvinistic pursuit. Lots of practical life lessons. Go ahead. Themes. Go ahead. Language arts, social sciences and law. History, geography, math, economics. It took us 9 hours to read this book. Can you imagine learning this much in 9 hours using the conventional approach? And we still discuss this book and the things that we learned in it every so often when we're making dinner together or driving in the car. It was possible for us to learn all of this because all of this information was deeply meaningful to us within the context of this engaging story, within the context of our trip to Nepal, and within the context of this work of creative genius that drew upon Jon Krakauer's divine gift for writing, his interest in mountain climbing and people, and his personal experience in this particular historical disaster. Okay, and all the information is interconnected like the roots of this plant. So when we learn bits and pieces of knowledge disconnected from their meaning and their context, it's like breaking off, if you were to break off root strands from this plant, what would happen to those strands of roots if you cut them off? They would dissolve into the soil because they no longer serve a purpose. Okay, next up. Play at creative genius. Okay, next one. We're going to go through these kind of quickly. Play is the work of the child, Maria Montessori. Go ahead. I play with microbes, Alexander Fleming. He actually would paint with microbes of different color that would grow into different colors. He would make paintings just for fun. Go ahead. Okay, this is Richard Feynman. If you're not familiar, he won the Nobel Prize in Physics, famous physicist. And at one point in his life, he considered leaving physics because he hated it. And he says, physics disgusts me a little bit now, but I used to enjoy it. Why did I enjoy it? I used to play with it. I used to do whatever I felt like doing. So I got this new attitude. I'm going to play with physics whenever I want to, without worrying about any importance whatsoever. Now, what's amazing about this story is that as soon as he adopted that new attitude, I shouldn't say as soon, a week after he adopted that new attitude, he was playing around with a plate, throwing it up in the air at the cafeteria at Cornell University, and ended up developing the physics that won him the Nobel Prize from that playing around with that spinning plate. Okay, go ahead. So there are actually 3 different types of play, which I won't get into today. But when kids write movie scripts, sell lemonade, build forts, plant a garden, follow drawing tutorials on YouTube, make birthday cards and gifts, organize a book club or a pickup game of capture the flag or foster a friendship, they are exercising their powers, they're exercising their creative power and engaging in powerful learning experiences. I know most people probably think play is important, but I don't know how many parents and educators realize how powerful it really is, or we would make a lot more time for this kind of play. All right, is there any scientific support for this model of learning? There's actually a lot of scientific support for this model of learning, and I will just talk about one. How many of you remember where you were when you heard about the terrorist attacks on 9/11? Okay, pretty much everybody. Can you remember details like what you were wearing, what seat you were in, what room you were in, who you were talking to, what you were eating, what you were doing? Most people can remember a surprisingly huge amount of information about where they were and what they were doing when they first heard about the terrorist attacks. So you remember it thanks to this part of your brain. This is your amygdala. Your amygdala is responsible for tagging memories according to importance. So if it deems incoming information as very important, it will tag it as very important, and it will be very quickly and easily recalled later on. Maybe even for the rest of your life, like the terrorist attacks. So how does your amygdala determine the importance of incoming information? Well, under MRI, the amygdala lights up when a person is emotionally engaged. So the more intense the emotions, the more activity there is in the amygdala, and the stronger the memory. Mary's whole heart was involved in Birthday Bake Shop, and still is with this Young Entrepreneurs Fair. When we were reading Into Thin Air, that evoked very strong emotions in me and Lydia, and that's why it's such a powerful memory, all those things we learned from that book. If you feel bored or apathetic toward what you are doing, learning, or experiencing, the amygdala will not be triggered and the memory will be weak or forgotten. Okay, next slide. Viktor Frankl figured this out long before we had the technology to measure it. If you're not familiar, Viktor Frankl is was one of the few survivors of Auschwitz concentration camp during the Holocaust, and he's a psychiatrist by profession. So in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he explains that once a man has been in one of these prison camps for long enough, his emotions become severely blunted because it's a psychological survival mechanism. So after witnessing a horrific scene in camp, Frankl explains, if my lack of emotion had not surprised me from the standpoint of professional interest, I would not remember this incident now, because there was so little feeling involved in it. If Viktor Frankl would have forgotten witnessing a horrific scene in that concentration camp because there was so little feeling involved in it, is it any wonder that students when we're trying to learn conventionally bits and pieces of knowledge that have been disconnected from their meaning, information that they're bored by or feel apathetic towards, is it any wonder that it can take so much time and effort to memorize that information for the test, and that often a lot of that information is forgotten after the test? Creation brings meaning and purpose to everything we learn. Okay, I'd like to conclude by reading one of my favorite Frog and Toad stories. This is a work of creative genius. It's called The Garden. Go ahead. Frog was in his garden. Toad came walking by. What a fine garden you have, Frog, he said. Yes, said Frog, it is very nice, but it was hard work. I wish I had a garden, said Toad. Here's some flower seeds. Plant them in the ground, said Frog, and soon you will have a garden. How soon? Asked Toad. Quite soon, said Frog. Toad ran home. He planted the flower seeds. Now seeds, said Toad, start growing. Toad walked up and down a few times. The seeds did not start to grow. Toad put his head close to the ground and said loudly, now seeds start growing. Toad looked at the ground again. The seeds did not start to grow. Toad put his head very close to the ground and shouted, now seeds start growing. Frog came running up the path. What is all this noise? He asked. My seeds will not grow, said Toad. You're shouting too much, said Frog. These poor seeds are afraid to grow. My seeds are afraid to grow? Asked Toad. Of course, said Frog. Leave them alone for a few days. Let the sun shine on them. Let the rain fall on them. Soon your seeds will start to grow. That night, Toad looked out his window. Drat, said Toad, my seeds have not started to grow. They must be afraid of the dark. Toad went out to his garden with some candles. I will read the seeds a story, said Toad. Then they will not be afraid. Toad read a long story to his seeds. All the next day, Toad sang songs to his seeds, and all the next day, Toad read poems to his seeds, and all the next day, Toad played music for his seeds. Still, the seeds did not start to grow. "What shall I do?" cried Toad. "These must be the most frightened seeds in the whole world." Then Toad felt very tired, and he fell asleep. "Toad, Toad, wake up," said Frog. "Look at your garden." Toad looked at his garden. Little green plants were coming up out of the ground. "At last," shouted Toad, "my seeds have stopped being afraid to grow." "And now you will have a nice garden too," said Frog. "Yes," said Toad. "But you were right, Frog. It was very hard work." He's wiping the sweat off his brow. Cultivating your children's creative power, education in general, does not have to be a time-consuming, expensive, complicated endeavor. If you don't know where to start by establishing a daily ritual of reading aloud to your kids from great books. Help your children with a project they're interested in doing. Visit a place you've always wanted to go. Plant that small, insignificant-looking seed and give it water and sunlight and time. It will grow into something far greater than you could ever imagine. As Frankl says in Man's Search for Meaning, a man who becomes conscious of the responsibility he bears toward a human being who affectionately waits for him, or to an unfinished work, will never be able to throw away his life. He knows the why of his existence and will be able to bear almost any how. Set out on a quest to find your why, that creation that you can contribute to the world that no one else can. Help your children on their quest to find their why. And once you do, there is nothing that will stop them from learning and doing whatever it is they need to do to achieve that. Thank you.